First, welcome to today's session on 5 sellable cookie cutter Azure solutions. My name is Andy Syrewicze, and I'll be kind of talking to you about this today. So let's start with our agenda. So first off, I'm going to do some basic introductions, myself, the company I work for, and then we're going to really get into what you're here to listen about today, and that is those 5 solutions I mentioned. We're going to talk about running simple web apps. We're going to talk about highly available VMs, things like offsite backup storage. We'll talk about distributed file storage with Azure Files. And one of my personal favorites, one that's been coming up a lot in some of the conversations I've been having with people lately, is this concept of a 100%, it says Azure-based, but it doesn't have to be Azure. It could be just general cloud, 100% based cloud virtual office. So we'll be talking about that a little bit, and then we'll have some wrap-up and Q&A at the end. Now, one thing about these use cases, I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of each of these use cases, actually how to technically do it and configure each setting, because it's a 30-minute session. We don't have time for that, right? What this is going to do is we're going to talk about this from a use case perspective with a little bit of pricing and sales talk mixed in. If you want to get into the nitty-gritty technical discussion, come see me at the booth after the talk here, booth 701. Just look for the big orange signs and you'll find me. So with that, let's do some introductions. Again, hi, my name's Andy Syrewicze. I am a technical evangelist with Altaro software. I've been in the industry for a while now. I actually think I have to change that to 16 years. The only difference between when I started and now is I have a few more gray hairs and a little bit more to carry around. So historically, I've always been focused on kind of the Windows Server stack, VMware, but really 10 years of my career was spent working in the MSP space specifically, and a large chunk of the time was spent as a senior cloud engineer, not only responsible for architecting and putting together cloud solutions for customers, but also talking to those customers about the sales, the pre-sales behind that. How can cloud solutions solve your business problems? And that's really relevant to today's discussion, because as we know, the cloud is becoming more and more popular, right? And so I'm really excited to kind of share some of my insights and experiences from over the years in today's talk. I am very active on Twitter. If we have any Twitter users in the room, my handle is there. Sorry, you're going to have to spell the last name. I have a buddy who says I need to change that to Andy Sandwich. That's what they called me in elementary school. But I just haven't gotten around to that yet. Also, we have 3 blogs that I am active on quite frequently, altaro.com/hyper-v/VMware and /MSP Dojo specifically. So with that, with Altaro software, we're at booth 701. We make backup software, some pretty amazing, easy to use, super powerful backup software. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about that product and how that works, come see us at booth 701. We'd be more than happy to answer your questions. So before I get into today's talk, I want to just kind of ask a question, just a general question of the group. Where are you at in your cloud journey? How many people have not used the cloud at all? Anybody? Don't be shy. Okay, that's what I expected. How many people use it a little bit? They use it for some stuff. Okay, that's pretty much what I expected. How many people use it for absolutely everything and they don't do anything on premises? I got 1, 2. Okay. I expected 0, but we got 2. I'm kind of surprised. So, all right. So that kind of helps me, kind of figure out how and what to, dig into as we go through these use cases. So the first thing I want to talk about is simple web apps. So if we start thinking about, things that you can take to your customers, and you can sell it to one customer and solve their business issue, and immediately go to customer B, do the same thing. Customer C, do the same thing. That's what a lot of these use cases I'm going to be talking about today is. And the first one that I always come up to is simple web apps. There are a lot of core business applications that customers have today that run on a web server, right? And that's one of the great things that's really nice about Azure is it's so easy to just spin up a web server, host up a website or a couple of websites, and you can do this a couple of different ways in Azure. So really it comes down to, do you want to do this in Azure IaaS? Do you want to spin up a virtual machine in Azure and install IIS or install Apache, give the VM a public IP address, configure your DNS? You could do it that way. That's definitely one option. The other option is doing it with Azure PaaS. So actually using Azure Web Apps. And in that case, Microsoft completely manages the underlying server infrastructure. And in this use case here, I'm talking specifically about IaaS, because that's most familiar to MSPs that are just starting to kind of dip their toe into this space. Because you're running the web server inside of a virtual machine, and it's very similar to what you're doing on premises today. So really, running a web server inside of Azure IaaS requires very few things. You need a virtual machine running a web server. You need to open up port 80 and 443. You have to let the customer get to the workload. You have to have a public IP address, and you have to have defined DNS settings. I mean, all the stuff for a traditional web server, right? And the main reason you would choose this particular hosting method over the PaaS route that I mentioned earlier is, let's say that maybe you have a customer who has an in-house web developer. Maybe they need access to the back end. Maybe they need to run a customized API against the web server, something along those lines. That's one reason why you would choose to go this route, because you have access to that back end. You have access to the virtual machine running the web server. In the PaaS world, you don't. Maybe you want to manage patch cycles yourself. Who heard about the Chrome vulnerability that just came out, I don't know, like 2 days ago? And the lead dev for Chrome basically said, yeah, everybody go patch, like, now. When the lead dev for Chrome says go patch now, you go patch now, right? So definitely, if you want to manage your own patch cycles, might be another reason you go this route. I mentioned integrations, other applications that might need access to the back end. Regulatory reasons. How many of you have customers that they have to adhere to things like HIPAA or PCI, and they're afraid of this whole cloud thing, or they're fine with cloud, but the entire stack needs to be accessible, including the operating system. That would be another reason you go this route. And from a pricing perspective, it's not really too bad when you start pricing web servers out in Azure IaaS, because really you're just pricing out a virtual machine. How strong does this web server need to be? As you know, Azure is a usage-based pricing model. So you select your size, and you get billed based on its size for however long it runs in a given month. And using the Azure pricing calculator, you can go out and you're going to get a fairly good idea of what it costs to run this virtual machine. You can tack on your margin on top of that, roll in any support services that you want to, and then you move on to the next sale at that point. So really, this is kind of a good entry-level cloud service that you can start offering to your customers when you start getting into Azure. Now, to move on to our second option here is highly available VMs in Azure. So how many of you have a customer that comes to you and says, I can't be down ever, not even for 30 seconds, ever, never let me go down? Just about everybody probably has a customer that says that, right? And I mean, to do HA on premises, it requires a lot of hardware, right? I mean, if you have a customer that really legitimately has a need to never go down for more than even 5 minutes, you're talking about, okay, now I need to have, a cluster that supports hot failover. You have to have stuff that handles networking failover. There's a lot of infrastructure involved in that, right? And the nice thing about Azure when you're talking about highly available workloads is that it's kind of designed for high availability in mind. You think about the geographic reach that Azure has. I mean, I've lost track of how many data center regions there are, really. It's a lot. I know they just opened up one in South Africa, I think. But the point is Azure provides a geographic reach that most MSPs just can't do themselves, right? So that's an advantage when you have a customer that maybe needs to have a cluster that spans geography. Another good point here is that, I mentioned the hardware, but Microsoft provides money-backed SLAs for their cloud services. I don't know too many cloud vendors that do that. So I mean, if there is a service interruption on the Microsoft end, that SLA is money-backed. So, you just think about that from an organizational perspective at Microsoft. If they ever go down, it's money out of their pocket, right? So that's more reason for them to be up and running most of the time. And then presence in the cloud means that VM's workload, it's already architected for disaggregated remote access. Basically what I mean with that bullet point is, think about a DR scenario. You know, the main site goes offline, it's not there anymore. You bring up the workload at a recovery site. Sure, the workload's up and running at the recovery site, right? But how does the end user get to it? You think about that access mechanism. There's some networking that needs to be done there. That's really the headache of DR, right, is managing that process. And the nice thing about doing this in the cloud is that when it's architected correctly from the front to the back, that piece of it's really already taken care of for you. So that's another advantage to running this inside of Azure. Some additional resources here. I wrote a blog post a little while back about reasons why you shouldn't try to build your own cloud. It makes sense for some people, most not. More than happy to get feedback on that, but after trying to do it for several years at my previous role, I am actually a large advocate of not trying to do it. So if you're interested in checking that out, feel free to check out that URL right there. And again, welcome any and all feedback on that. So I talked about architecting for high availability in Azure. Basically what I wanted to do with this slide is just kind of show you the different options that are available, that are available for providing HA. So, if you have a single VM in Azure and you're running it on premium SSD storage, you're going to get a SLA availability of 99.9. Pretty good, right? If you need more than that, now you're talking about what Azure calls availability sets. This is where you're going to pair 2 or more virtual machines in a set. And what this really does is it protects you against things like the rack your virtual machine is running on in Azure goes down for maintenance, or maybe the PDU in that rack failed. Protects you against, rack failures inside the data center like that. But let's say you need to go even further than that. Let's say you want to protect this customer from, maybe an entire Azure data center goes unreachable or something like that. This is where availability zones comes in. So basically, this is cross-region high availability for a virtual machine running in Azure. So when you have a customer come to you and says, hey, I have a workload, it needs to be up and accessible all the time, you've got a lot of options here in Azure. And same thing with the web services. You can go and open the Azure calculator, figure out what this is going to cost, and then you can build your margins on top of that, build your support services in, really work it into your own pricing model, and it gives you a good idea of where to go. And then on top of that, we've got things like site recovery and region pairs. Really the key point here being region pairs. If you have any customers that do work in Europe, Germany specifically, I'm going to pick on Germany, they have very strict laws about where data exists. The data has to remain within the geographical confines of Germany. So that makes architecting a geographic, highly available VM a little difficult, right? So Azure has what's called region pairs, where if you need to set up an availability zone in a specific region, it gets paired automatically with a region that's still within the geographical confines of that country. And that's really what that whole section is about. So with that, let's move on to our third option here, and that's offsite backup storage. And I'm going to pick on us a little bit just because we're a backup vendor, right? And really, I wanted to talk about this as it's a fantastic entry point into cloud sales, into the cloud market, because you think about the low-hanging fruit inside of your infrastructure. And that's, like I said already, web services is a really good one, but offsite backup storage is a really good one too. I mean, how many people have installed a SAN or a NAS at a remote location, and you have to deal with a storage vendor, and it's just a huge headache, right? I'll raise my hand. I've dealt with that issue too many times over the years. But, Using Azure really allows you to leverage that cloud storage and manage it on your own, which is really nice. I mean, just look at how competitively this is priced. I mean, if you use anything that leverages block blobs in Azure, which is the very basic, I believe they use erasure coding inside of blob storage, that comes up to 2 cents a gig. So I mean, like our product, for example, we can leverage blob storage and connect directly to it and use it as offsite backup storage, and it's only going to cost 2 cents a gig per month. Now I know that there's some CSP, cloud service provider programs with Microsoft that lets you get even a little bit better pricing than that. Don't quote me on that, but I've heard some rumblings on that. So it might be even better than 2 cents a gig a month. And a couple other things to note here about the storage. Storage transactions are a separate charge, and they, last I knew, they measure them per the 10,000, so 10,000 reads and writes combined. And I think you get like the first 100,000 free, which for most workloads is plenty enough. If you have a workload that's going to be doing a lot of disk churn, a lot of reads and writes, you may want to look at that one a little bit more in depth, but I always like to point it out so that way there's no surprises for anyone. Egress bandwidth. This is one that surprises a lot of people too when it comes to backup storage. It's free to push data into Azure. Push as much as you want in there. But when you have to do, like we're talking about backup software or recovery, there's a fee for pulling data out. So just keep that in mind when you're pricing out your services. There's a cost for support, but being an MSPs, you know that. And then again, why choose Azure for offsite backup storage? Geographic reach. You don't have to support hardware, which, don't get me wrong, I've banked a large part of my career on infrastructure. I'm at a stage in my life where I don't want to manage servers. I don't want to go in and look at blinky lights in a data center anymore. I'll look at blinky lights on an Azure dashboard instead. So let's actually see how easy it is to attach to cloud storage. Just going to do just a quick demo here. And again, I'm picking on our product in this particular case. So this is our management tool, and you can't see that. There we go. So this is our management tool. And this is just our backup storage view, our backup locations view. You see the center pane is local on-premises backup. We're not really talking about that right now. But over here, we've got offsite locations. And the nice thing about this feature is we don't have to spin up a virtual machine in Azure. We don't have to carve off storage space in a VM or anything like that. We just create a general storage account in Azure. We grab a connection string, which is directly on the dashboard for that storage account, and we paste it into the screen. Done. That's it. I didn't have to provision a server. I didn't have to install a SAN. I didn't have to configure file systems. I said create, copy, paste, submit, done. Now I can start sending offsite backups to that location. So you think about that from an MSP perspective where you want to do as much as you can, as fast as you can. Huge time saver. It really makes things a lot easier. So from there, let's come back here and we'll move on to our next option. I think we're on number 4. I lost track. Is anybody keeping track for me out there? I think we're on number 4. All right. Distributed file storage with Azure Files. All right, we're right about on time, I think. So how many of you support customers that are on the smaller end, and maybe they have a single server at their location that they're using for file storage, or maybe they're even using like a small NAS, like a Ready NAS or a Buffalo NAS. Got a couple of them? And I mean, cost is a real concern for those customers, right? They don't want to pay for expensive hardware and then have to renew it every 3 years and pay maintenance and all that stuff. They just want a place to stick their files, right? That's where Azure Files comes in. That's really a nice, service for that particular use case. It's useful for all business sizes, but it fits particularly well in that space. Because what it does is it allows you to carve off a file share inside of an Azure storage account and connect any device to it. So think of it as like a cloud-based Map Drive, basically. And that's essentially what we're going to do here. So if I open up the Azure portal, so I've already created a storage account here. This is just a basic Generation 1 storage account. Super basic, easy to create. And I've not really done anything with it yet. But if I go down here to Files, you can see that I've carved off this Robbins file share. And if I drill down into this, there's nothing here yet. No files found. How do I connect an endpoint to this location so it can start leveraging it? It's really easy. We simply click Connect, and it gives us all the scripts we need to do this. So I can connect this file location to a Windows box, a Linux box, or Mac OS. So really all I have to do is I just have to select, okay, what drive letter do I want it to give? We'll go with R. And at this point, I just copy the script. Let's go and execute it. Let me actually move over my PowerShell window. That way you guys know there's no smoke and mirrors happening here. Let's execute that. That should be fairly quick. And that should be fairly quick. All right, everybody's, okay, all right. I'm sweating for a second there. All right, so that completed successfully. Now if I open up File Explorer and I go to this PC, again, move it so you guys can see. Here we've got a Robbins file share. It looks just like a map drive to the end user. It appears as a map drive. So very familiar with what they're already used to using. I can just say make a new folder. I can say MSPs rock. All right. Now if I open up the Azure portal again and go back to overview, drill down in there, hit refresh, MSPs rock. So now I can see I've created a folder in here, and end users could use this, they could leverage it, they use it all they want, and life is good. Makes things simple. And really where this fits is those files that are generally, they don't depend on high performance. If you have a file that requires low latency, obviously you're going to want to host those types of files on premises still, but this is a nice option for that. I got a question over here.
What about permissions?
So what about permissions? It is possible to assign permissions to this. You can control it by virtual network. So you have this concept in Azure of virtual networks. It's just like a VNet on an on-premises Hyper-V or VMware installation. You could control permissions like that. And you can drill down and I think you can do a little bit of file level permissions as well. So a couple different options there. I actually have to open up PowerPoint to make this work again. I'm like, wait, why did the slide not advance? Let me get that back out here.
Is it synced or all in pro?
Next slide. I was just getting to that. I always get that question, so I started including that in my presentations on this. So let's say you want to take it a step further, and you want to have it on-premises, and in the cloud as well. That's where this new service called Azure File Sync comes into play. So you have this Azure File Share hosted up in Azure. Let's say you want it on-premises as well. Who remembers DFS? Yeah. Was anybody particularly happy with DFS? No. This is just like DFS, but it's actually good. So that's always the way I describe it. It's just like DFS, but it's actually good. And the other nice thing here is it really allows you to create like this concept of a cloud tier. You have this on-premises location that your users are reading and writing from, and then it gets pushed up into the cloud tier, which is really just an Azure File Share. And the other nice thing is if maybe the on-premises server goes offline, they can still access the file share directly via the method I just showed you. Or maybe you want to sync it to another location. You can sync this between locations. And let's say maybe one of the servers fails. That server is dead, it's gone. You simply build another one and sync to it. because the data exists in several locations. The other nice thing about this as well is when you sync it on premises, if you want to use your backup application to back it up and put it into your normal backup routine, you can do that as well. So a lot of different options when it comes to hosting file services for your customers. Question?
File locking?
File locking? As in, is it a problem?
No, if two users access the same file from multiple locations, is it locked?
If a user accesses files from multiple locations, two users from different locations access the same file, is it locked? I've not run into that issue myself. I've not seen that.
Depends on the application.
It's going to depend on the application, true. But if it's like a database application or something, you wouldn't really use this for that type of use case. But for traditional file storage, I've not seen that to be an issue.
What about something simple like a spreadsheet or something?
Spreadsheet, Excel should yell at you and say, hey, file is in use. Yeah.
That's the most common thing we've run into.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. All right.
Quick question.
Yes.
How about anything with AutoCAD?
AutoCAD, you would definitely want to use the on-premises with Azure File Sync option, because if you're running CAD on your machine and you're accessing the CAD file in the cloud, the latency between is just gonna make your CAD program go nuts.
But does it bring in the picture for multi-location?
I don't see why it wouldn't, because as far as the endpoint is concerned, it's just a map drive. Yeah.
One last question.
Yeah.
What is the difference between this and SharePoint?
So that's a good question. So the question was, for those who may not have heard it, is what's the difference between this and SharePoint? So SharePoint is more for your intranet situations, right, where you have an intranet. Maybe you want to use some document repositories in SharePoint. This is more if you just need basic file services. And you don't want, everything that comes along with SharePoint. So if you just want to, here's a file share, write some files to it, that's what this is intended for. But definitely, if you need some of the more advanced features that SharePoint offers, you definitely want to go that route. So, all right, so our last cookie cutter option here, 100% virtual hosted Office in Azure. And this really isn't so much of a fleshed out use case, more as it is something to get you thinking about a potential offering. And that is 100% virtual Office possible? 3, 4, 5 years ago, if you asked me that question, I would have said, eh. But today, I'm a little bit more optimistic about that because of new services like WVD, which Windows Virtual Desktop. That's one of the new features that they announced at Microsoft Ignite back in September. No, I forget. Anyway, that basically allows you to spin up Windows 10 virtual machines inside of Azure and attach them to a VNet, consume services on that VNet. So I mean, really the concept, the idea of, a user being anywhere in the world connecting to a virtual desktop in Azure or maybe an RDS deployment in Azure and then accessing the services using that landing point, that's a very real possibility. And the nice thing about that is no on-premises footprint required. So like I said, while this isn't a concrete, you can go do this solution today, it at least gives you the pieces here that would be required in order to achieve that. So, like I said, this is a use case I've been seeing a lot of interest in lately, and it's definitely something that I would encourage people to go take a look at because it's possible now with some of the new technologies that are out there today. So with that, we get to our wrap-up and Q&A, and I know I am just about out of time, so I'm going to, I got 1 or 2 slides I want to mention. If you have any additional queries or you want to talk about something in more of a community type of format, we do have some new forums online, dojo forums at altaro.com. I'm active there if you want to come take a look. Right now it's just Hyper-V forums that are live, but we're going to be adding VMware and MSP forums soon. Again, I got some slides about us here. If you want to come find out more about the product, again, come see us at booth 701. I'm not going to bore you with that information right now. We also have an Office 365 backup product that is new. Again, come talk to us at the booth if you're interested about that. And now we get to Q&A. I think we have maybe a minute or two here. So, Any lingering questions? How is it priced? Which piece specifically? Any. So the way, that's a good question. Very valid question. So the way that Azure works is each service is priced a little differently. So the nice thing about Azure is they have all kinds of crazy documentation on the pricing. So if you go out to azure.com, there's a pricing tab. And not only is there a calculator there where you can go and say, okay, how much is this service going to cost me? How much is this service going to cost me? You can look at it that way. If you want the real nitty-gritty on how service pricing is figured, you can drill into the documentation and get more information that way as well. They have fantastic documentation for that.
Good question. So to run a VM in Azure, right, they charge you by the minute or partial minute?
Correct. So the question is, to run a VM in Azure, they charge it by the minute or partial minute. It definitely is time running. If I remember correctly, again, if you go into the documentation, they have the breakdown. If I remember right, they combine memory per hour with a vCPU per hour. There's a calculation there. The easiest thing to do is to actually go open the calculator and say, I want a VM of this size, and it'll tell you what it costs to run for whatever amount of time you put in there.
But the question is, why would you have a VM that only runs for a certain amount of time?
Right, so the question is, why would you have a VM that only runs for a certain amount of time? Typically you wouldn't, but there are some cases, especially in test dev scenarios, where maybe they're testing a new product or something like that. They spin up the VM, they do their testing, and they shut it down when they don't need it. There's actually a new feature new-ish feature in Azure, auto shutdown. So you can define a time during the day that, okay, this VM is running and it's 7 p.m. at night, shut it down so you're not incurring any additional cost. So yeah, definitely a good question. With that, I think I'm out of time. If there are any additional questions, feel free to come up to the front. I'm more than happy to answer any more questions, or come see me at the booth, again, 701. Look for all the orange. Other than that, thanks for coming. Appreciate your time, and tip your waitress.